Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to dim the lights, pull the blanket a little higher, and wander into the messy, overdramatic, and occasionally absurd world of ancient Greek myths. You know, the stories that everyone pretends to know because they saw Disney's Hercules once in the 90s. But in reality, they're far stranger, pettier, and much less family-friendly than anyone likes to admit. So if you're here for clean heroism, noble sacrifices, and statuesque men in shining armor, well, technically we have those. But they'll probably be cheating on someone, killing their children, or turning into a swan halfway through. Because Greek mythology. And don't worry, you don't need to sit upright with a notebook. Tonight is all about floating gently along as we meet gods, mortals, and kings who really could have used therapy, but instead just cursed each other for eternity. Classic. So let's begin with the big boss of Greek myths, the man, the myth, the lightning bolt, Zeus. Now, Zeus is often described as the king of the gods, which sounds impressive. But what it really meant was, he had authority, a terrible temper, and absolutely no impulse control when it came to romance, or whatever he considered romance. His main hobby was shape-shifting into various animals and, let's say, pursuing mortals. If you've ever wondered why swans, bulls, and golden rain show up in Greek art, that's why. Yes, golden rain. No, not the nice kind of rain. Zeus's love life, or chaotic hunting log, really, ended up shaping half of Greek mythology. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Helen of Troy. All conveniently his children. Because Zeus was basically spreading dynasties like Oprah, you get a demigod, you get a demigod, everyone gets a demigod. Of course, none of this went over well with his wife, Hera. Queen of the gods. Patron of marriage. Which is ironic because her marriage was the least stable relationship in the entire pantheon. Imagine dedicating your whole divine portfolio to marriage while your husband is out here disguised as a goat seducing shepherd girls. It's rough. Hera's response? Eternal grudges. If you were a woman who caught Zeus's attention, congratulations, you now had Hera as your personal enemy for life. And if you happened to give birth to one of his children? Oh, sweet summer child, prepare for Hera to unleash a lifetime of creative torment on you and your offspring. Step aside, evil stepmothers, Hera invented the role. But let's drift a little into the mortals' world. Because Greek myths weren't just entertainment. They explained history, culture, and why certain royal families were, let's say, deeply cursed. Take the House of Atreus. Honestly, if you're looking for dysfunctional dynasties, they make the Tudors look like a wholesome sitcom. Atreus was a king of Mycenae, and his family tree was essentially a long-running soap opera of murder, betrayal, and poorly timed feasts. Atreus himself became infamous for serving his brother Thyestes a banquet, made from Thyestes' own children. Yes. Family dinners were complicated in ancient Greece. Forget awkward conversations about politics. This was literal cannibalism. And because Greek myths loved to keep the curses flowing, this one haunted generations. Atreus' descendants included Agamemnon, the guy who dragged Greece into the Trojan War, and Orestes, who spent years avenging murders in an endless cycle. You know those family reunions where everyone has some unresolved drama? Multiply that by 1,000 and add divine curses. That's the House of Atreus. Speaking of the Trojan War, oh yes, we're floating there now. This is probably the best-known Greek myth, but also the most hilariously petty. The entire decade-long war began not because of territory, not because of resources, but because of a beauty contest. Here's how it went down. Eris, the goddess of discord, whose job description was basically professional troublemaker, wasn't invited to a divine wedding. Naturally, She showed up anyway and tossed a golden apple into the party with the inscription, "To the fairest." Which sounds like a sweet compliment, but was really just the ancient Greek version of starting a Twitter fight. 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all claimed the apple. Because of course they did. Instead of just splitting the apple 3 ways and calling it a day, they demanded an impartial judge. Enter Paris, a Trojan prince who was better at looking handsome in a field than making wise decisions. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised political power. Athena promised military victory. And Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Naturally, Paris went for the pretty girl. And so, with one bad decision, Paris doomed his entire city, launched a war that dragged on for years, and gave Homer enough material to write the Iliad. Lesson learned: never let 3 divine women ask you to pick who's prettiest. The fallout will be epic. Now, Helen of Troy, the so-called face that launched 1,000 ships, is one of those mythological figures who's simultaneously blamed for everything and somehow still not given much agency. Depending on the version, she either ran away with Paris willingly, or she was kidnapped. The myths aren't exactly consistent. But what's clear is that she was treated like a living prize. Men went to war for her. Cities burned for her. And she was, essentially, the ancient Greek equivalent of the ultimate trophy wife. Meanwhile, her husband, Menelaus, was furious. Understandable. Though instead of just writing a strongly worded letter, he called in all of Greece for backup. Which, to be fair, was possible because before Helen got married, all her suitors had made a pact to defend her marriage no matter what. Imagine making all your exes sign a loyalty oath. Problematic? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Now, let's float over to another iconic myth, Theseus and the Minotaur. Theseus is often presented as a classic Greek hero. Strong, brave, charismatic. But also, kind of a jerk, if we're honest. His claim to fame was heading into the labyrinth of Crete to kill the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull monster. Which sounds heroic until you remember that the Minotaur was actually the product of yet another messy divine prank. See, King Minos of Crete had offended Poseidon, the god of the sea. So Poseidon made Minos' wife fall in love with a bull. Yes, a literal bull. And the Minotaur was the result. Because nothing says punishment like forcing your queen into a barnyard romance. Anyway, the Minotaur got locked in a labyrinth, and every year Athens had to send youths to be eaten by it. Theseus volunteered to stop this nonsense, which is noble, except he mostly succeeded thanks to Ariadne, King Minos' daughter. She gave him a ball of thread so he could find his way out. Without her, he'd still be wandering those corridors. And how did Theseus repay her? By abandoning her on an island the next morning. Smooth. Hero of the people, breaker of hearts. What's interesting is how these myths shaped real Greek politics and culture. Athens, for example, loved to promote the story of Theseus because it made them look heroic and important. The Athenians were essentially using mythology as a form of ancient propaganda. They weren't just telling bedtime stories, they were building national identity. The same goes for Sparta and Troy. The Spartans leaned into the Helen of Troy saga to highlight their martial pride and their role in the Trojan War. Alright, still with me? Blanket tucked in, lights dimmed? Good. Because it's time to drift a little further into the strange dreamscape of Greek mythology. We just finished wandering through Theseus's labyrinth of questionable morals, and now we're floating toward another famous monster story. Yes, the one with snakes for hair. It's Medusa time. Now, Medusa is one of those characters who gets treated very unfairly. Pop culture usually paints her as some hideous monster who deserved her fate. But when you go back to the older myths, her story is a lot more tragic, and honestly depressing. Originally, Medusa wasn't even a monster. She was a beautiful mortal woman, sometimes described as a priestess of Athena. Which sounds like a pretty good gig. Until, of course, Poseidon entered the picture. Depending on the version, Poseidon either seduced or assaulted her inside Athena's temple. Which was, obviously, a big no-no. Athena's response? Instead of punishing Poseidon, the actual intruder, she cursed Medusa. Because apparently sisterhood was not a divine priority. Athena transformed Medusa into a gorgon, with snakes for hair and a face so terrifying that anyone who looked directly at her turned to stone. Essentially, Medusa got cursed for being the victim of divine drama. Now, fast forward a little, and along comes Perseus, a hero conveniently backed by the gods. His mission? To kill Medusa and bring back her head. Which he managed with the help of divine tools, a shiny shield from Athena, winged sandals from Hermes, and a sword that was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of a cheat code. Perseus crept into Medusa's lair, used the shield as a mirror so he wouldn't look directly at her, and cut off her head while she was sleeping. Heroic? Debatable. Effective? Definitely. But here's the fun twist. When Medusa's head was chopped off, her blood gave birth to Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. Because apparently, beheading was just another form of childbirth in mythology. Don't ask too many questions, it's Greek myth, logic doesn't apply here. Perseus carried Medusa's head around like a multi-purpose weapon, using it to turn enemies into stone. Eventually, he gave it to Athena, who mounted it on her shield. Which feels like the ultimate insult. Punish Medusa, then keep her head as a stylish accessory. And yet, despite her tragic story, Medusa became one of the most iconic symbols in Greek art. Her face was plastered on temples, shields, and coins, not as a cautionary tale, but as a protective emblem. Because if you can't fix the injustice, at least you can commodify it. Now, let's glide over to another hero, probably the most famous of them all, Heracles. Or as the Romans renamed him, Hercules. Same guy. Different branding. Heracles is the poster child of Greek heroism. Muscles, bravery, endless labors. But what people forget is that most of his story is just one long cautionary tale about anger management, divine grudges, and very poor parenting. First of all, he was another illegitimate son of Zeus. Which, as we know by now, automatically meant Hera had him on her eternal hate list. Heracles' very name, ironically, means glory of Hera, which was Zeus's passive-aggressive way of trying to appease her. Spoiler, it didn't work. Hera harassed Heracles his entire life. She sent snakes into his crib as a baby. Luckily, Heracles strangled them with his bare hands. Which sounds impressive until you realize that means he was literally a violent toddler. As he grew, he performed countless feats of strength, but his defining moment came when Hera drove him into a fit of madness. In that state, he killed his own wife and children. Yes, the greatest hero of Greece was also guilty of family annihilation. And how did he make up for it? With the famous 12 labors. Basically a mythological probation sentence. The labors included killing the Nemean lion, which had impenetrable skin, so Heracles strangled it to death and then wore its hide as a fashionable cape. He also killed the Hydra, a serpent with regenerating heads. Every time he cut one off, two grew back. The solution? He burned the next shut. Because if at first you don't succeed, try setting things on fire. Other labors involved cleaning the Augean stables, which were so full of dung that it was considered impossible. Heracles solved it by rerouting a river through the place. Practical. Also gross. There were also more random tasks, like capturing a golden horned deer, stealing the girdle of the Amazon queen, and finally dragging Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld, up to the surface. Imagine walking your dog, but it's 3 dogs in one, and Hades is angrily watching from below. Through all these labors, Heracles became the model of brute strength and perseverance. But when you step back, it's basically just one long list of chores inflicted on him because his dad couldn't keep his toga on. Classic Zeus problem. And speaking of problematic heroes, let's float gently to Achilles. Now, Achilles is best known for his role in the Trojan War, and of course, for the heel situation. The myths say his mother, Thetis, dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. But she held him by one heel, leaving it exposed. Which is how we get the phrase Achilles' heel. In reality, Achilles was less of a noble warrior and more of a sulky diva. Sure, he was the greatest fighter of the Greeks. But he also spent half the war refusing to fight because he got into a petty argument with Agamemnon over a woman. His best friend Patroclus had to die just to get him back into action. When Achilles finally rejoined the battle, he went on a killing spree that was impressive but also kind of horrifying. And when he finally faced Paris, yes, the beauty contest judge, he was shot in that one vulnerable heel. Anticlimactic, but poetic. Achilles is a reminder that in Greek mythology, being powerful almost always came with a built-in flaw. Perfection didn't exist. You were always doomed by something, whether it was your temper, your pride, or the one part of your body your mom forgot to waterproof. Let's take a calmer detour now to one of the more tragic myths, Orpheus and Eurydice. Unlike most Greek heroes, Orpheus wasn't known for muscles or violence. He was a musician. His songs were said to be so beautiful that they could charm wild animals, calm storms, and even soften the hearts of the gods. Which is a nice change of pace in a world where most problems were solved with decapitation. Orpheus married Eurydice, but soon after, she died from a snake bite. Heartbroken, Orpheus did the unthinkable. He traveled to the underworld to bring her back. Using his music, he convinced Hades and Persephone to let her return, on one condition: he must walk in front of her and not look back until they reached the surface. Of course, Orpheus couldn't resist. Just before they exited, he turned around. And Eurydice vanished forever. It's one of the few myths that doesn't end in bloodshed, but in quiet despair. The lesson being, patience is hard, even when the stakes are literally eternal love. Now, if you think Greek myths were just isolated bedtime stories, think again. They seeped into daily life. Farmers prayed to Demeter for crops. Sailors begged Poseidon for calm seas. Lovers whispered to Aphrodite. And if something went horribly wrong, whether a plague, a storm, or a bad harvest, well, clearly someone had offended the gods. It was a worldview where divine beings were always lurking. Alright, so we've met heroes, monsters, and gods who really should have been in counseling. But nothing says Greek mythology like a cursed royal family. And the award for most cursed of all probably goes to Oedipus. Yes, that Oedipus. The guy with the prophecy. The one Freud later dragged into psychology forever. Don't worry, we'll get there. Slowly. Let's start at the beginning. Oedipus was born to King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes. Sounds nice and normal, right? Except Laius had been warned by an oracle that if he ever had a son, that boy would kill him. Now, Laius did what any rational person would do when faced with a divine prophecy. He ignored it and had a child anyway. Because in myths, no one has ever successfully avoided a prophecy. When Oedipus was born, Laius panicked. He ordered the baby to be abandoned on a mountainside with his feet pinned together. Very humane parenting. But as often happens in myths, a shepherd rescued the baby and passed him along until he ended up being raised by the royal family of Corinth. So Oedipus grew up not knowing he was adopted. He thought he was just a normal prince with slightly weird feet. Then, one day, he went to the Oracle of Delphi to ask about his future. And the oracle dropped the bomb. He was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Which is awkward. Understandably horrified, Oedipus decided the best way to avoid this was to never return home to Corinth. Logical enough. Except Corinth wasn't his real family. The prophecy wasn't about them. And by trying to dodge fate, Oedipus was basically running straight toward it. On the road out of town, he got into an argument with a stranger at a crossroads. Words turned into blows, and Oedipus killed the man. Unfortunately, that man was King Laius, his real father. Prophecy Part 1, check. Then, Oedipus continued on to Thebes, which was being terrorized by the Sphinx. The Sphinx, for those who need a refresher, was a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of a bird, and the head of a woman. She posed riddles to travelers and ate anyone who answered wrong. Honestly, she was basically the first game show host, but with higher stakes. Her riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, to his credit, nailed the answer: man crawling as a baby, walking upright as an adult, and leaning on a cane in old age. The Sphinx, apparently unable to handle being bested, threw herself off a cliff. And just like that, Oedipus saved Thebes. The grateful citizens made him king. And they gave him the widowed queen as his wife, Jocasta, his mother. Prophecy Part 2, check. Now, to be fair, Oedipus had no idea. For years, he ruled Thebes successfully, fathered children, and thought everything was going fine. Until, of course, a plague hit the city. The oracle announced that the plague was punishment because Laius's killer was still at large. And so Oedipus launched an investigation. Which is almost funny in hindsight, like starring in a true crime show where the killer is yourself. One by one, clues piled up until the truth came out. He had killed his father, married his mother, and fathered his own siblings. Family dinners were probably tense. When Jocasta realized, she hanged herself. Oedipus, in despair, blinded himself with her brooch pins. Which, if you're keeping track, means the prophecy was fulfilled in full, and in the worst possible way. The Oedipus myth isn't just tragic, it became the blueprint for Greek tragedy itself. The whole point wasn't the twist ending, because audiences already knew it. The point was watching a man try desperately to escape fate, only to run straight into it. It's the dramatic equivalent of slowly walking into a glass door you've been warned about. Painful, but inevitable. Later, Sigmund Freud borrowed the myth to explain his theories about unconscious desires. Which is why now the phrase Oedipus complex gets thrown around at therapy sessions and in bad jokes. Honestly, Oedipus deserved better than becoming shorthand for questionable psychology. But Oedipus wasn't the only tragic king in Greek mythology. Let's float sideways to another royal family, the House of Cadmus, also of Thebes. Because apparently, Thebes couldn't catch a break. Cadmus, the city's founder, had his own weird backstory. He was originally from Phoenicia, and when his sister Europa was abducted by Zeus, disguised as a bull, because of course, Cadmus went searching for her. The search failed, but on the oracle's advice he founded Thebes instead. To establish the city, he had to fight a dragon, sacred to Ares. After slaying it, he sowed its teeth into the ground, and from them sprang up armed warriors. These Sparti, literally, sown men, fought each other until only 5 survived. They became the ancestors of noble Theban families. So yes, Thebes was founded on blood, violence, and survivors of a gardening accident. Cadmus himself married Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. Sounds glamorous, but their descendants were cursed for generations. Which explains why Thebes kept producing tragic figures like Oedipus, Antigone, and Pentheus. It's like the city was built on bad karma. Speaking of Antigone, let's linger with her for a moment. She was Oedipus's daughter, or daughter-sister, depending on how you count it. After Oedipus's downfall, she became famous for her defiance. When her brothers Eteocles and Polynices killed each other fighting for Thebes' throne, the new king Creon forbade anyone from burying Polynices, branding him a traitor. But Antigone insisted on giving her brother a proper burial, defying the king's edict. For her loyalty, she was sentenced to be buried alive. Because apparently, burying people alive was Creon's go-to punishment. Very original. Antigone's story became one of the most famous tragedies, symbolizing the clash between human law and divine law, personal duty and political authority. But it's also just another sad chapter in the long saga of Thebes being the least lucky city in mythology. Now, let's drift away from Thebes and into another gloomy corner, the house of Tantalus. Yes, the same Tantalus who gave us the word tantalize. Which tells you already that this family is going to involve suffering. Tantalus was a king who decided to test the gods by serving them a stew made from his own son, Pelops. Because apparently cannibalism was a recurring theme at royal dinners. The gods, fortunately, weren't fooled. They restored Pelops to life and cursed Tantalus to eternal punishment in the underworld, standing in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink, and beneath fruit trees that pulled back whenever he tried to eat. Hence Tantalize. Pelops, revived, went on to become a major figure himself. He married Hippodamia, but only after winning a rigged chariot race against her father. He sabotaged the king's chariot, leading to the father's death. A great start to married life. But of course, the curse lingered. Pelops's descendants included Atreus and Thyestes, the brothers we met earlier, with their delightful child-eating banquet, which eventually produced Agamemnon, Menelaus, and the endless drama of the Trojan War. So if you trace it back, half of Greek mythology's disasters came from one guy trying to feed his kid to the gods. Dinner choices really do matter. Greek tragedies loved this kind of generational curse. The idea that sin or hubris in one generation would echo down through the family tree. It wasn't just personal, it was hereditary doom. So, picture this. The Trojan War has finally ended. After 10 years of sieges, battles, and general misery, the Greeks are sailing home. The wooden horse has done its job, Troy is in flames, and everyone should be celebrating. Except, this is Greek mythology, which means no one is allowed a happy ending. Especially not Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae and commander-in-chief of the Greek forces. Which sounds impressive, until you realize he got the job mostly because his brother Menelaus married Helen, and then she ran off, or was kidnapped, by Paris. So basically, the entire Trojan War was Agamemnon's extended family squabble. Imagine starting a world war because your sister-in-law moved in with someone else. But even before the war began, Agamemnon made some very questionable choices. When the Greek fleet was about to sail to Troy, the winds died. Not just bad sailing weather, completely calm. The oracle said the goddess Artemis was angry, because Agamemnon had offended her somehow. Maybe he killed one of her sacred deer. Or maybe he just had an arrogant face. The myths aren't specific. The solution? Sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, to appease Artemis. And because Agamemnon was apparently incapable of subtlety, he actually did it. Depending on the version, Artemis swooped in at the last second and replaced Iphigenia with a deer, spiriting her away. Or not, and Iphigenia just died. Either way, Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, was not thrilled. Now, fast forward 10 years. Agamemnon comes home from Troy, dragging along Cassandra, a Trojan princess who was both his prisoner and, awkwardly, his new companion. Which is exactly what every long-suffering wife wants to see after a decade of waiting. Her husband walking in with a younger woman who also happens to be cursed by Apollo, never to be believed when she tells the truth. Clytemnestra had been stewing in rage for years. Between her daughter's sacrifice and Agamemnon's arrogance, she was done. So she plotted. And when Agamemnon returned, she welcomed him with smiles, feasts, and a luxurious purple carpet. Walking on purple fabric was normally reserved for gods. But Agamemnon, basking in his ego, strutted across it anyway. Which, in Greek mythology, is basically the same as hanging a sign around your neck that says "Kill me now." Once he was inside, Clytemnestra killed him. Again, depending on the version, she either stabbed him while he was bathing or trapped him in a net and hacked him to pieces. Either way, Agamemnon's homecoming was less welcome party and more murder mystery, but without the mystery. And Cassandra? Well, she warned everyone that death was coming. She always did. But thanks to Apollo's curse, no one ever listened. So she too was killed by Clytemnestra. Honestly, Cassandra deserved a better script. She had the worst deal in mythology, accurate visions of disaster, but zero credibility. Imagine being doomed to be right all the time and still ignored. It's basically Twitter. But of course, the curse of the House of Atreus didn't stop there. Because Clytemnestra herself wasn't safe. Her son Orestes grew up haunted by his father's murder and the cultural expectation that he had to avenge it. Ancient Greece was very big on blood for blood. Therapy? No. Revenge? Always. So Orestes returned to Mycenae and killed his mother. Which sounds extreme, but in myth, it was considered the proper thing to do. Of course, this also unleashed the Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance, who pursued him relentlessly. Because in Greek mythology, there's no such thing as closure. You either die, or you get chased by winged demon women for eternity. Eventually, Orestes found relief through a trial in Athens, judged by none other than Athena. She cast the deciding vote in his favor, sparing him and ending the cycle of vengeance. Which, in mythological terms, was a pretty big deal. It marked a shift from endless blood feuds to something vaguely resembling a legal system. Ancient Greece, inventing democracy one family murder at a time. But Agamemnon wasn't the only Greek leader to have a rough homecoming after Troy. The war was cursed for pretty much everyone. Take Menelaus, for instance. He did eventually get Helen back. But his journey home was long and complicated, full of shipwrecks and detours. And when he finally arrived, he had to live with the fact that he started a 10-year war over a woman who, frankly, didn't seem that into him. Or take Ajax the Lesser. He dragged Cassandra from Athena's temple during the sack of Troy, which was a big mistake. Athena destroyed his ship with a storm. He clung to a rock, boasting that the gods couldn't kill him. Poseidon promptly smacked him off the rock with a trident. Hubris, it never ends well. And then, of course, there's Odysseus. His homecoming story was so long it got its own epic, the Odyssey. 10 years of wandering, detours with sorceresses, detainment by nymphs, and one very cranky Cyclops. But we'll drift into his saga later. For now, it's enough to say that Troy wasn't really the end of anything. It was just the middle of everyone's misery. What's striking about the Trojan War myths is how much they emphasize the futility of it all. Heroes fight, cities burn, gods meddle, And in the end, nobody really wins. Troy is destroyed. The Greeks lose half their leaders to disasters on the way home. Families are shattered. And yet, these stories were told and retold for centuries, not because they offered happy endings, but because they captured something deeply human. The sense that life is messy, fate is cruel, and no amount of glory can save you from your family's bad decisions. Which, come to think of it, is the unofficial tagline for most Greek myths. Let's let that settle like a heavy wool blanket for now. In the next part, we'll drift into Odysseus's endless wandering, Cyclopses, sirens, and why coming home to Ithaca was almost more trouble than it was worth. So Odysseus, king of Ithaca, known for being clever, slippery with words, and just slightly too pleased with himself. If Agamemnon was the warlord and Achilles was the diva, then Odysseus was the sly politician of the Greek army. He's most famous, of course, for masterminding the Trojan horse. Which sounds brilliant: hide soldiers inside a giant wooden horse, will it into Troy, and boom, victory. But let's be honest, it only worked because the Trojans were collectively terrible at critical thinking. Imagine seeing a giant wooden animal left by your enemies after a 10-year war and deciding, yes, let's wheel this suspicious object directly into the heart of the city. What could possibly go wrong? Anyway, Odysseus got the credit for that win. And when Troy fell, he was eager to head home. Ithaca wasn't exactly a superpower, but it was his kingdom. His wife Penelope was waiting, and his son Telemachus had grown up without him. So all he had to do was sail across the sea. Easy, right? Wrong. This was Greek mythology. The gods weren't about to let him off that easily. The first big problem was Poseidon. Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, during one of his many side quests. And while that was certainly useful for not being eaten alive, it also guaranteed that Poseidon, god of the sea, was now his personal nemesis. And if you're trying to sail home, having the sea god against you is less than ideal. But let's back up to the Cyclops incident, because it's one of the highlights of Odysseus's wandering misadventures. Odysseus and his crew landed on an island with caves full of food and sheep. Always a red flag. If a place looks too good to be true, it's probably about to involve monsters. And indeed, the cave belonged to Polyphemus, a giant cyclops with a bad temper. Polyphemus promptly ate a few of Odysseus's men, which, while horrifying, was also just Tuesday in Greek mythology. Odysseus, being clever, introduced himself to Polyphemus as nobody. Then, after getting the Cyclops drunk, he and his men drove a sharpened stake into his one eye. The next morning, when Polyphemus screamed for help, his fellow Cyclopes asked who was hurting him. He shouted, "Nobody!" and they shrugged it off. Wordplay saves the day. Odysseus and his men escaped by clinging to the undersides of sheep. Yes. Full-grown warriors hanging under sheep bellies. Dignified? Not really. Effective? Absolutely. But here's where Odysseus's cleverness crossed into arrogance. As they sailed away, he couldn't resist shouting his real name back to Polyphemus, which meant Polyphemus could call on Poseidon to curse him specifically. And thus began the longest detour in history. One of the more memorable detours was with Circe, the sorceress who lived on an island and had a talent for turning men into pigs. Literally. She welcomed Odysseus's crew, gave them a feast, and promptly transformed them into swine. Honestly, it's one of the more accurate metaphors for men on vacation. Odysseus, with some help from the god Hermes, resisted her magic. Instead of being turned into a pig, he ended up in Circe's bed. Which, let's be real, was kind of his default problem-solving method. Circe eventually freed the men and became surprisingly cooperative. In fact, Odysseus ended up staying with her for a whole year. A full year. The man who kept insisting he was desperate to get home somehow found time for a 12-month island affair. But sure, he was in a rush. After Circe, the adventures kept piling up. There were the sirens, whose singing was so enchanting that sailors would crash their ships trying to reach them. Odysseus, curious as always, wanted to hear the song but lived to tell the tale. So he plugged his men's ears with wax and had himself tied to the mast of the ship. The sirens sang, Odysseus begged to be released, and his crew wisely ignored him. Honestly, it was one of his more responsible decisions. Then came Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla was a six-headed monster who snatched sailors off the decks. Charybdis was a whirlpool that could swallow ships whole. The passage between them was so narrow you basically had to choose: lose a few men to Scylla, or risk total destruction with Charybdis. Odysseus, being pragmatic, chose Scylla. 6 men dead, but the ship survived. Greek mythology, where leadership is measured by who you're willing to sacrifice. Another pit stop was with Calypso, a nymph who lived alone on an island and promptly fell in love with Odysseus. She kept him there for 7 years. 7. Which makes Circe's 1-year detour look like a quick weekend getaway. Calypso promised him immortality if he stayed, but Odysseus pined for home. At least, that's what he said. Though somehow he didn't pine hard enough to actually leave until the gods forced Calypso to let him go. By this point, Penelope back in Ithaca had been waiting nearly 20 years. 20. And not just waiting, fending off suitors who were pressuring her to remarry. She stalled them by weaving a funeral shroud by day and unraveling it by night, buying time in the most patient display of passive resistance ever recorded. Honestly, Penelope deserved her own epic. When Odysseus finally did make it home, he didn't just walk in and announce himself. No. He disguised himself as a beggar, tested everyone's loyalty, and then orchestrated a bloodbath in his own hall, slaughtering all the suitors. Which, depending on your perspective, was either justice or just a really dramatic way of saying, "Honey, I'm home." In the end, Odysseus got what he wanted: his kingdom, his wife, his son. But he also left behind a trail of wrecked islands, dead crewmen, and several very annoyed gods and goddesses. He's remembered as the clever hero of the Odyssey, but also as the patron saint of procrastination. The story of Odysseus is fascinating not because he's flawless, but because he's so very human. He's brilliant but arrogant, determined but easily distracted, desperate to go home but constantly sidetracked by temptations. In other words, he's basically all of us trying to finish a task on time. The only difference is that instead of Netflix or TikTok, his distractions were sorceresses, cyclopes, and whirlpools. We'll pause the sails here before drifting into Part 6, where we'll dive into the myths of the underworld, Hades and Persephone, and why eternity in Greek mythology sounded less like paradise and more like a poorly managed theme park. So, Hades. The god everyone respected, but nobody invited to parties. He was one of the 3 big brothers. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the sea, and Hades drew the short straw. He ended up with the underworld. Which, to be fair, was an important job. But it also meant his press coverage was not great. Unlike Zeus, Hades didn't run around starting affairs every 10 minutes. Unlike Poseidon, he didn't keep showing up in the form of animals or floods. Hades mostly stayed in his realm, did his job, and kept the dead where they belong. He wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly cruel. He was just serious, strict, and deeply committed to making sure dead people stayed, well, dead. But because humans really don't like death, Hades developed a reputation as spooky and grim. Basically, He was that guy in high school who dressed in all black, never talked much, and scared people just by existing. Now, the underworld itself wasn't some fiery hellscape. That whole burning pit of torment thing came much later, courtesy of other religions. In Greek mythology, the underworld was more like a gloomy subterranean kingdom with multiple neighborhoods. You had the fields of Asphodel, which was where most ordinary souls ended up. Imagine an endless, gray meadow where you wander around aimlessly forever. Not exactly a thrilling afterlife, but at least it wasn't torture. Then there was Tartarus. That's where the gods tossed the truly wicked, or just anyone who annoyed them a little too much. Titans, oath-breakers, people who tried to overthrow Zeus, you name it, Tartarus was basically the eternal dungeon. On the flip side, you had the Elysian Fields. That was the VIP lounge of the dead. Heroes, demigods, and the especially virtuous got to hang out there, enjoying eternal springtime and music. Though, given how subjective, virtuous, was in Greek mythology, it was mostly just where Zeus's favorites ended up. And finally, there was the river Lethe. Souls drank from it to forget their past lives. Because apparently the afterlife had a built-in memory wipe system, which, depending on how your life went, was either a blessing or a cosmic delete history button. Now let's talk about Persephone, the queen of this gloomy place. Her story is one of the most famous myths in the Greek world, and it basically doubles as an explanation for why we have seasons. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of agriculture. And like many figures in Greek myth, she was basically living her best life, wandering in flower fields, minding her own business. Until Hades spotted her and decided, "Yep, that's my queen now." Subtlety was not his strong suit. So he kidnapped her, dragged her down into the underworld, married her, and made her queen. Charming courtship, truly. The gods called it the rape of Persephone. But remember, rape here carried the older meaning of abduction. Still, the vibe was not great. Demeter, her mother, was understandably furious. She refused to let crops grow until her daughter was returned. So the earth basically withered into one giant famine, which put pressure on Zeus, because humans starving meant fewer sacrifices for the gods. Priorities. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Persephone would split her time. Part of the year with her mother, part of the year with Hades. The catch? Persephone had eaten a few pomegranate seeds in the underworld, which bound her there permanently for a portion of the year. This was the cosmic equivalent of signing a contract without reading the fine print. And thus, the myth explained the seasons. When Persephone was above ground, Demeter rejoiced, crops flourished, and it was spring and summer. When Persephone returned to Hades, Demeter mourned, crops died, and it was fall and winter. Very poetic, if a little dark. But here's where it gets interesting. Persephone wasn't just some helpless victim. Over time, myths portrayed her as growing into her role as queen. She became stern, powerful, and sometimes even more feared than Hades himself. Mortals who tried to mess around in the underworld often found Persephone was not the forgiving type. For example, there's the story of Orpheus. He was a legendary musician whose wife Eurydice died. Heartbroken, Orpheus journeyed into the underworld, played his music, and charmed everyone, even Hades and Persephone. They agreed to let Eurydice return with him, on one condition: he couldn't look back at her until they were both out. Naturally, he looked back too soon. Eurydice vanished. Persephone had been merciful, but the rules were the rules. And then there was Theseus and Pirithous, two heroes who had the brilliant idea of sneaking into the underworld to kidnap Persephone. Yes, they thought stealing the Queen of the Dead was a good plan. Spoiler, it wasn't. Hades caught them and politely glued them to chairs. They sat there for eternity, stuck, until Hercules came along much later and managed to pull Theseus free. Pirithous remained stuck. Persephone's kingdom, Persephone's rules. Hades himself was never portrayed as particularly cruel in these stories. If anything, he came off as oddly consistent. He didn't cheat, didn't lie, didn't throw tantrums like Zeus. He was basically the dependable bureaucrat of the pantheon, which made him boring compared to his brothers, but also strangely respectable. In fact, some ancient Greeks even prayed to Hades for wealth, since precious metals came from underground. So he wasn't just Lord of the Dead, but also Lord of hidden riches. A god of gloom, yes, but also of abundance. The Greek underworld wasn't really about punishment, not in the way we think today. It was more about the inevitability of death, and the idea that everyone, no matter how great, eventually ended up there. Kings, peasants, heroes, villains, everyone wanted the same gray fields. It wasn't hell. It was just the end. Which is somehow creepier, and also oddly comforting. So next time you picture Hades, think less flaming devil with a pitchfork, and more stern administrator of the eternal DMV. Efficient, unemotional, and making sure the line keeps moving. Persephone at his side, ruling over a kingdom where heroes visit, poets get lost, and mortals sometimes wander in and deeply regret it. Let's drift gently onward from death back to the land of the living. In Part 7, we'll explore the story of Jason and the Argonauts, the most chaotic road trip in Greek mythology, complete with golden sheep, bad leadership, and a witch girlfriend who did way too much heavy lifting. So, Jason? Not exactly the most original name in the Greek world, but this guy managed to slap his name on one of the biggest adventure stories ever told. The tale of Jason and the Argonauts was basically ancient Greece's Avengers crossover. A bunch of heroes all in one ship, sailing off to do something impractical and dangerous because, well, apparently they didn't have better hobbies. The story starts in Iolcus, a city in Thessaly, where Jason's family drama was already cooking. His uncle, Peleus, had stolen the throne from Jason's father, because of course he did. Peleus was one of those power-hungry but still superstitious types. He'd heard a prophecy warning him to beware of a man with one sandal. Naturally, he ignored it until, surprise, Jason showed up one day wearing only one sandal. And why was he missing a sandal? Because on the way to Iolcus, he had helped an old woman across a river. The old woman, inconveniently enough, turned out to be Hera in disguise. So Jason was already wrapped up in divine politics before he even opened his mouth. Peleus, realizing his nephew could be a problem, didn't just kill him outright. That would have been too easy. Instead, he told Jason he could have the throne if he proved himself by completing an impossible quest. Classic setup. Peleus sent him to fetch the Golden Fleece, which was being guarded far away in Colchis, on the edge of the known world. Translation: go die somewhere inconvenient. Jason, of course, didn't go alone. He assembled the Argonauts, named after their ship, the Argo. Now when I say assembled, I mean it was basically an all-star lineup of Greek mythology. Hercules was there, briefly, until he wandered off to do his own thing. Orpheus, the famous musician, came along too, because apparently they needed some background music. Castor and Pollux, the twin brothers who later got turned into the Gemini constellation, signed on. Atalanta, the token woman and fast runner, joined the crew. The list goes on. It was like Greek mythology's version of an ensemble cast where everyone's egos were bigger than the ship itself. The Argo itself was special too. Built with help from Athena, it had a talking piece of wood in its prow. Yes, a talking plank. Apparently, that was considered high-tech navigation at the time. So, off they sailed. And like any road trip with too many strong personalities, things got messy fast. Their first stop was the island of Lemnos, which at that point was populated entirely by women. Why? Because they had killed all the men. Long story. The Argonauts, being predictable, decided to stay there for a while and mingle. This little detour nearly derailed the entire quest, but eventually they remembered, oh right, the fleece. Then there was the time they encountered King Phineus, a blind old prophet who had been cursed by the gods. Every time he tried to eat, harpies would swoop down and steal or ruin his food. The Argonauts, being vaguely heroic, chased the harpies away and earned some goodwill. Phineus, in return, gave them directions for navigating the dangerous clashing rocks ahead. Which is a reminder that in Greek mythology, GPS usually came from suffering old men with terrible curses. The clashing rocks, Symplegades as they were called, were two giant cliffs that smashed together whenever ships tried to pass. The Argonauts sent a dove through first to test it. The dove barely made it, losing just a few tail feathers. Taking that as a good omen, they rode like their lives depended on it, which, to be fair, they did, and managed to squeeze through just in time. Afterward, the rocks stopped moving entirely. Convenient. Eventually, they reached Colchis, home of the Golden Fleece. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Because the Golden Fleece wasn't just lying around for the taking. It was guarded by a massive, never-sleeping serpent. And the king of Colchis, Aedes, wasn't exactly eager to hand it over. Aedes told Jason he could have the fleece, but only if he completed a series of impossible tasks. Which was basically Greek myth shorthand for, I'm going to try to kill you in a creative way. Task number 1. Yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls and plow a field with them. Task number 2. Sow the field with dragon's teeth, which would then sprout into an army of warriors. Task number 3. Survive. Jason, on his own, would have been toast. But here's where Medea enters the picture. Medea, daughter of Aedes, was a sorceress. And she was exactly the kind of overpowered character that keeps the plot moving. Thanks to a little divine meddling from Hera and Aphrodite, Medea fell in love with Jason almost instantly. Questionable ethics aside, she basically carried him through every task. She gave him a magical ointment to protect against the fire-breathing bulls. She told him the trick for beating the dragon-toothed warriors: throw a rock into their midst so they'd turn on each other. And finally, she used her own magic to put the serpent guarding the fleece to sleep. Jason's contribution? Showing up and looking heroic while Medea did 90% of the work. So Jason got the fleece. Great. Time to head home, right? Not so fast. King Aedes wasn't thrilled about his daughter betraying him. Medea helped Jason and the Argonauts escape, but in the process, she committed one of the darker acts in Greek mythology. She brought along her younger brother, Absyrtus, and when Aedes pursued them, she killed the boy and scattered his body parts in the sea. Aedes, horrified, had to stop and collect them, giving the Argo time to escape. It's the kind of thing that makes you realize maybe Medea's loyalty was intense. The journey home was just as chaotic as the way there. The Argonauts got lost multiple times, ran into more angry kings, and generally stretched the whole adventure into what felt like an endless detour. Eventually, though, they returned to Iolcus with the fleece. And Peleus? The uncle who sent Jason on this suicide mission? He didn't exactly reward him. Instead, Medea handled the problem. She tricked Peleus' daughters into killing him, convincing them that chopping him up and boiling him in a cauldron would rejuvenate him. Spoiler, it didn't. In the end, Jason and Medea's story didn't wrap up happily ever after. But that's a tale for another time, involving betrayal, revenge, and Medea proving she was not the kind of woman you wanted to cross. For now, the Argonaut saga stands as one of the longest, most complicated road trips in Greek mythology, a chaotic mix of divine meddling, poor leadership, and one witch girlfriend who did absolutely everything while Jason collected the credit. Let's float forward now to part 8, where we'll sink into the tragedy of Oedipus and the family curse, one of the bleakest yet oddly fascinating stories the Greeks ever told, full of irony, awkward family dynamics, and the world's worst prophecy fulfillment. So, you've probably heard of Oedipus. Even if you don't know the full story, the name alone tends to ring bells, and not always for the most bedtime-friendly reasons. But don't worry, we'll keep it soft and slow, and glide through the whole tale with the calm detachment of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. The story begins in Thebes. Because, let's be honest, most chaotic Greek tales somehow circle back to Thebes. The royal couple there, King Laius and Queen Jocasta, were living the dream, except for one little problem. An oracle had given them a prophecy, and not a nice one. It basically said, "Congratulations, your future son will kill his father and marry his mother." That's the kind of thing that really kills the baby shower mood. Naturally, Laius and Jocasta decided to outsmart fate. Their brilliant plan? When their baby was born, Laius had the infant's ankles pierced and bound, then ordered a servant to abandon the child on a mountainside. Because in Greek myths, the default response to any awkward prophecy was, "Just ditch the baby." Problem solved, right? Of course not. The servant couldn't bring himself to kill the child, so he handed the baby over to a shepherd from Corinth. The shepherd took him back to Corinth's royal family, who, conveniently, had no children of their own. They adopted the boy, named him Oedipus, which charmingly translates to swollen foot, and raised him as their own. Fate, meanwhile, sat back and said, "Cute attempt. But I'll see you soon." Oedipus grew up believing he was a Corinthian prince. Things were fine until one day, he overheard a drunk guy at a banquet mutter that he wasn't really the king's son. Classic drunk dinner party sabotage. Naturally, Oedipus had questions. So he went to the oracle at Delphi to ask about his parentage. The oracle, in true Greek style, ignored the actual question and instead dropped a bombshell. "You're destined to kill your father and marry your mother." Thanks, oracle. Very reassuring. Oedipus, horrified, decided not to return to Corinth, thinking this would spare his adoptive parents. Instead, he headed toward Thebes, which, unfortunately for him, was exactly where his biological parents lived. The gods must have been chuckling at this point. On the road, Oedipus had one of those encounters that changes everything. He met a man and his attendants blocking the way. The man, being royal and cranky, ordered Oedipus to move aside. Oedipus, being young and prideful, refused. A fight broke out, and Oedipus killed the man and his retinue. Unbeknownst to him, that man was Laius, the king of Thebes, his actual father. One half of the prophecy, checked off. But Oedipus didn't stick around to admire his handiwork. He kept moving toward Thebes, where the city was in chaos thanks to a monster problem. The infamous Sphinx had parked herself on the road outside town, devouring anyone who couldn't answer her riddle. The riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? People had been dying left and right, because apparently the brainpower of Thebes wasn't great. But Oedipus, clever enough, solved it. The answer was man, crawling as a baby, walking upright as an adult, and using a cane in old age. The Sphinx, humiliated, threw herself off a cliff. Problem solved. The people of Thebes, thrilled that someone had dealt with their monster issue, made Oedipus king. And as a bonus, he married the widowed queen, Jocasta, his mother. Second half of the prophecy, checked off. Oedipus thought he'd outsmarted fate, but really, He just walked right into it wearing a victory crown. At first, everything seemed fine. Oedipus was a popular ruler. Thebes thrived. He and Jocasta had several children together. Nobody asked too many questions, and life was weirdly normal for a while. But fate has a way of circling back. Years later, Thebes was hit by a terrible plague. Desperate, Oedipus sent for the oracle to find out why the gods were angry. The oracle replied that Thebes was cursed because Laius's murderer had never been punished. The city wouldn't heal until the killer was found. So Oedipus, with all the righteous energy of a man who doesn't know he's the problem, launched an investigation. He was determined to uncover the truth. He questioned witnesses. He summoned prophets. He even cursed the unknown killer, declaring that the man deserved exile and ruin. That part was awkward in hindsight. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out. The details matched. The old king killed on the road. The prophecy. The adoption. Jocasta put it together first. She begged Oedipus to stop digging, but Oedipus was stubborn. When he finally realized the truth, that he had killed his father and married his mother, it shattered him. The ending was suitably grim. Jocasta couldn't bear the horror and hanged herself. Oedipus, in despair, took the pins from her dress and blinded himself. He exiled himself from Thebes, wandering as a broken man, guided only by his daughter Antigone. And so the prophecy was fulfilled in full, despite every attempt to dodge it. The story of Oedipus became one of the most famous cautionary tales in Greek literature. The lesson, according to the Greeks, you can't outrun fate, no matter how many detours you take. Of course, another lesson might be, don't abandon babies on mountainsides, don't kill random strangers on the road, and maybe ask for someone's family history before marrying them. But the Greeks weren't really into practical advice. Let's drift forward now to part 9, where we'll look at Heracles and his 12 labors. The ultimate story of anger management, questionable chores, and a man who somehow turned every punishment into a weird workout routine. So, Heracles. Or if you're Roman, Hercules. Same guy, different branding. He's probably the most famous hero the Greeks ever produced, and his resume is basically one long list of ridiculous chores he didn't sign up for. Let's start at the beginning, because like all good Greek tales, it begins with Zeus not minding his own business. Zeus, the king of the gods and professional serial cheater, decided he absolutely had to sleep with Alcmene, a mortal woman. Of course he did. And being Zeus, he couldn't just show up like a normal guy. He disguised himself as her husband, Amphitryon, and spent an entire night with her. Or, depending on which version you read, 3 nights. Because why not triple the deception? The result was Heracles. Well, technically 2 babies were born, Heracles, fathered by Zeus, and Iphicles, fathered by the actual husband. Twins. But only one of them came with a divine paternity test and a future of endless misery. Lucky Heracles. Naturally, Hera, Zeus's wife, wasn't thrilled about this. You'd think she'd be used to Zeus's antics by now, but no, every time, she acted like it was the first betrayal. And instead of blaming her husband, she focused her fury on the poor kid. Classic Hera. She tried to kill baby Heracles by sending 2 snakes into his crib. But little Heracles just grabbed them and strangled them with his infant hands, giggling like it was playtime. Cute. And mildly terrifying. Growing up, Heracles was big, strong, and, to put it kindly, not the brightest. His education in music and culture went about as well as you'd expect. At one point, his music teacher got annoyed with him, and Heracles, ever the problem solver, hit him with his lyre and killed him. Which was not exactly a gold star student moment. Still, Heracles grew into a powerful warrior. He married a princess named Megara and had children with her. Things might have gone well, but Hera wasn't done messing with his life. She sent madness upon him. In a fit of insanity, he killed his wife and children. When he finally snapped out of it and realized what he'd done, he was crushed. In despair, he went to the oracle at Delphi to ask how he could atone. The oracle, apparently in the mood for entertainment, told him to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and perform whatever tasks he demanded. And so began the famous 12 labors of Heracles, a mix of impossible chores, bizarre errands, and straight-up nonsense. Labor 1. The Nemean Lion. Heracles was told to slay the Nemean lion, a beast with impenetrable skin. Normal weapons didn't work, so Heracles did the logical thing and wrestled it to death with his bare hands. He then skinned the lion using its own claws and wore the pelt like a gruesome hoodie. That became his trademark look, ancient fashion statement achieved. Labor 2. The Lernaean Hydra. Next, he had to kill the Hydra, a multi-headed serpent. Every time he cut off a head, 2 more grew back. Not exactly efficient. Luckily, his nephew Iolaus helped by cauterizing the stumps with fire. Hera, annoyed by the teamwork, sent a giant crab to bite Heracles, but he squashed it underfoot. That crab later got a constellation as a participation trophy. Labor 3. The Ceryneian Hind. This one was less violent and more like a really slow wildlife documentary. Heracles had to capture a sacred deer belonging to Artemis. It had golden antlers and was faster than the wind. He chased it for a year. Yes, a full year. When he finally caught it, he made sure to apologize profusely to Artemis before handing it over. Labor 4. The Erymanthian Boar. Heracles had to capture a giant boar that terrorized a mountain. His method? Chase it into the snow until it got tired. Then he tied it up and carried it back. Eurystheus, the king who assigned these labors, freaked out when he saw it and hid inside a storage jar. Very regal. And so on, because these tasks never ended. Let's keep floating. Labor 5. The Augean Stables. This one was gross. Heracles had to clean the stables of King Augeas, which housed thousands of cattle and had never been cleaned. Imagine centuries of manure. Instead of scrubbing, Heracles just rerouted 2 rivers to wash it out in a day. Ingenious. Also disgusting. Labor 6. The Stymphalian Birds. These were man-eating birds with bronze beaks and metallic feathers. Hera clearly had run out of normal animals to send. Heracles scared them off with a noise-making rattle, then shot them down with arrows. Goodbye, evil pigeons. Labor 7. The Cretan Bull. This was the father of the Minotaur, because of course Greek myths like to recycle characters. Heracles captured it, wrestled it down, and dragged it to Eurystheus, who again panicked and hid in his jar. Labor 8. The Mares of Diomedes. These were flesh-eating horses. Heracles fed their owner, King Diomedes, to them as a kind of karmic justice. Once they'd had their snack, the horses calmed down and could be tamed. Dark, but effective. We're not done yet. Labor 9. The Belt of Hippolyta. Heracles was sent to fetch the magical belt of the Amazon queen, Hippolyta. At first, she was willing to give it to him peacefully. But Hera stirred up trouble, convincing the Amazons that Heracles was there to kidnap their queen. Battle broke out. Heracles killed Hippolyta and took the belt. Diplomacy level 0. Labor 10. The Cattle of Geryon. Heracles had to steal the cattle of Geryon, a monster with 3 bodies. He managed it, but not without detours involving rivers, deserts, and a golden cup borrowed from the sun god Helios. Like I said, these tasks were never straightforward. Labor 11. The Apples of the Hesperides. golden apples, guarded by nymphs and a dragon. Instead of fighting the dragon, Heracles tricked Atlas, the titan holding up the sky, into fetching the apples for him. When Atlas tried to dump the job of holding up the heavens onto Heracles, Heracles tricked him back and escaped with the apples. Smooth. Labor 12, the capture of Cerberus. Finally, Heracles had to go to the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog. Hades agreed, as long as Heracles didn't use weapons. So he wrestled Cerberus into submission and dragged him up to the surface. Mission complete. And that was the 12 labors. Though, technically, Heracles did more side quests later, because the Greeks couldn't resist piling on extra misery. What makes Heracles' story stand out isn't just the feats of strength, but the constant undertone of tragedy. He was always atoning, always suffering, always cleaning up the mess left by either his own actions or Hera's vendettas. For all his muscle, he never got much peace. In the end, Heracles died painfully, poisoned by a tunic smeared with centaur blood, thanks again to the chaos of his complicated love life. But after all the suffering, the gods finally granted him immortality. He joined them on Olympus, and even Hera eventually called a truce. Though one imagines that family dinners up there were awkward. And so Heracles, the ultimate ancient strongman, became the symbol of perseverance through impossible odds. Or, if you look at it another way, the symbol of how not to get on Hera's bad side. Now, let's float gently onward to part 10, where we'll wander into the tragic beauty of Orpheus and Eurydice, a love story that really should have ended with, "Don't look back." But of course it didn't. So Orpheus. If Greek mythology had a sensitive musician archetype, he's the poster boy. He wasn't out there slaying monsters or cleaning up cosmic stables. His superpower was music. He could charm literally anything: humans, animals, trees, even rocks. His lyre, a little harp-like instrument, basically turned him into the Beyoncé of ancient Greece. If he played, you stopped, listened, and probably cried. Naturally, someone with this much talent had to have a tragic love story. Enter Eurydice. She was beautiful, of course. Greek myths rarely allow a woman to just be average-looking and fun at parties. Orpheus fell deeply in love with her, and for a while, everything was perfect. Birds sang along when he strummed his lyre, rivers paused their flow to listen, and you'd think the gods would let them have a peaceful life. But this is Greek mythology. Of course they didn't. One day, Eurydice was wandering through a meadow when she was bitten by a snake. Just like that, one random snake bite, and she was gone. Ancient Greeks really leaned on snakes as the ultimate plot device. Orpheus was devastated. He couldn't eat, couldn't sing, couldn't even handle daylight. So he decided on the most ambitious romantic gesture possible. He would go down to the underworld and get her back. Now, the underworld wasn't exactly known for leniency. Dead meant dead. But Orpheus, being the world's greatest musician, had a shot. He descended into the realm of Hades, strumming his lyre as he went. And, as always, his music worked its magic. First, he charmed Cerberus, the terrifying three-headed guard dog. Instead of tearing him apart, Cerberus wagged his tails and let him pass. Then he reached the souls of the dead, shades wandering aimlessly, and they too paused, mesmerized by his music. Even the harsh Furies, those goddesses of vengeance who usually had one mood, angry, felt their cold hearts soften. Finally, Orpheus stood before Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. Normally, they were the ultimate no-refunds department. But Orpheus sang his grief, and it was so haunting, so beautiful, that even Hades himself had tears in his eyes. Not an easy thing to do, considering Hades usually ranks somewhere between Stonewall and resting grumpy dad face. So the gods agreed, Orpheus could take Eurydice back. But there was one condition, and here's where Greek mythology really loves its tragic clauses. The rule was simple. As they walked out of the underworld, Orpheus must not look back at her until they both reached the surface. Not once. Not even for a second. Seems easy, right? Just don't look back. Walk straight ahead. Hands to yourself. But, of course, the very fact that there was a condition meant it was doomed. So Orpheus and Eurydice began their climb back to the living world. He led the way, strumming gently, and she followed behind in silence. Step after step, winding paths, endless shadows. He couldn't hear her footsteps, because she was a shade, after all, but he trusted she was there. And yet the doubt grew. What if Hades had tricked him? What if Eurydice wasn't really behind him? What if he walked all the way to the surface only to discover he was alone? As they neared the exit, sunlight broke faintly ahead. Orpheus stepped into the light. He was out. But Eurydice was still in the shadows, one step behind. And in that moment, impatient, desperate, he turned to look. Big mistake. In an instant, Eurydice was pulled back, vanishing like smoke. One glimpse, and she was gone forever. He reached out, but there was nothing to grab, just empty air. She had made it so far, only to be lost at the very threshold of life. Orpheus begged to go back again, but Hades was unmoved. Rules were rules, and he'd already broken them. The underworld doesn't do second chances. So Orpheus wandered back into the world above, alone. His music changed. No longer songs of joy or love, now just sorrow, endlessly echoing his loss. Birds stopped singing with him. Trees no longer swayed happily. Everything he played was just heartbreak. And what happened to him afterward? Well, the myths disagree. Some say he swore off women completely, which offended a group of frenzied Maenads, followers of Dionysus, who eventually tore him apart. Others say he simply wasted away in grief, still playing until his last breath. Either way, his story ends the same way it lived, in song, but never in peace. The myth of Orpheus and Eurydice stuck with the Greeks not just as a cautionary tale, but as something deeply human. That urge to look back. That tiny, fatal doubt. It's the ultimate, what-if, moment, a mistake made out of love, but still a mistake all the same. And so Orpheus remains one of the most tragic figures in mythology. Not a warrior, not a conqueror, just a man whose music could move gods, but whose heart couldn't handle silence. Now let's drift toward part 11, where we'll meet one of the most tragically vain mortals ever, Narcissus, the man who quite literally died of self-love.
Hey guys, welcome back. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's take a very slow walk through one of history's longest gilding projects. And yes, I mean long, because tonight we're talking about the Great Wall of China. Now, the thing about the Great Wall is that it's one of those monuments everyone knows about, but very few people actually understand. It's like the Mona Lisa of architecture. Everyone's seen it on a postcard, but no one has actually thought about the fact that it took centuries of bad leadership decisions, questionable military strategy, and quite a lot of forced labor to make it happen. So let's just float back a couple thousand years and settle in. Don't worry, this won't be one of those action-packed history documentaries with pounding drums and swooping camera shots. Nope, we're just here to take the scenic route across stones, dirt, and dynasties. Because if there's anything the wall represents, it's stubbornness stretched out over 13,000 miles. So, where do we even start? Technically, the Great Wall isn't even one wall. It's more like a bad group project where every dynasty added their own little section, didn't match the design, and then left the mess for the next guy to deal with. Some walls were made of tamped earth, some were made of stone, some collapsed within a decade. Others are still standing centuries later. In short, it was less a single continuous barrier and more like a weird family quilt sewn together by people who hated each other. But of course, the Chinese emperors loved a good PR spin, so they called it Wanli Chongcheng, the Long Wall of 10,000 Li. That's about 5,500 miles, though if you're being picky, some estimates stretch it to 13,000. Basically, if you walked it, you'd need very good shoes and possibly a therapist afterward. Now, the first emperor to really get this whole "let's build a massive wall" idea rolling was Qin Shi Huang. And if you know anything about Qin Shi Huang, you'll know he was basically the overachiever nobody liked. This is the guy who unified China, burned books, buried scholars alive, and thought drinking mercury was a solid long-term health choice. So yes, of course he was also the first to say, hey, let's link all these random little border walls into one giant mega wall. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler, everything. Because while Qin Shi Huang had the vision, he also had a workforce made up of peasants, convicts, and soldiers who probably would have preferred to do literally anything else. The working conditions? Brutal. The pay? Essentially non-existent. And the food? Let's just say a lot of those workers didn't exactly make it back home. Legend even says their bodies were buried inside the wall itself, which isn't technically true, but it's the kind of morbid bedtime story that's stuck around anyway. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the Qin dynasty, China already had smaller defensive walls. We're talking as far back as the 7th century BCE, when the various warring kingdoms decided they really didn't like each other, or the nomadic tribes lurking just beyond their borders. So each little kingdom built its own sad attempt at a wall. Imagine a bunch of neighbors building fences out of whatever junk they had lying around. Some used packed dirt, some used wood, and most of them crumbled faster than you can say, cheap construction. When Qin Shi Huang took over in 221 BCE, he basically looked at all these patchy walls and said, yeah, let's make this my legacy. Forget the fact that nobody actually asked for a wall. Forget that nomadic horsemen could just ride around it anyway. The important thing was to make a statement, and Qin loved statements. This is the same man who built the terracotta army, after all. He wasn't exactly a minimalist. Of course, the building process was less about architectural genius and more about throwing bodies at a problem until it sort of worked. The workers would ram layer after layer of earth into wooden frames until they had a giant dirt pancake masquerading as a wall. And when I say ram, I mean literally stomping and pounding the soil into submission with wooden tools. Very high-tech stuff. Now, dirt walls might sound flimsy, but surprisingly, some of those tamped earth sections are still standing today, which says less about their quality and more about how much people in the 21st century don't really mess with old dirt. But still, it's impressive. The funny thing is, for all the effort, Qin Shi Huang's wall didn't actually do its job. You see, nomadic groups like the Xiongnu weren't exactly dumb. They didn't walk up to the wall, see the dirt, and go, oh no, impenetrable barrier. No, they just found gaps, bribed guards, or, wait for it, went around. Revolutionary tactics, I know. So, while the wall looked intimidating on a map, in practice, it was about as effective as putting a "do not enter" sign on your diary. People just ignored it. After Qin's dynasty collapsed, because apparently ruling with paranoia and mercury poisoning isn't sustainable, the next big player was the Han dynasty. And here's where things got more interesting. The Han were like, okay, Qin had the right idea, but let's not just make a wall. Let's also build fortresses, watchtowers, and garrisons along it. Essentially, they tried to turn the wall into a military highway. And to be fair, it worked. Sort of. The Han dynasty's wall-building efforts stretched thousands of miles. Soldiers stationed there could light signal fires to warn about invasions. Imagine the world's oldest version of a group chat. Only instead of LOL and emojis, you got a column of smoke saying, "Nomads incoming, please advise." Now, the Han also used the wall to protect the Silk Road, because by this time, trade with Central Asia was becoming a very big deal. And if you've ever seen a map of the Silk Road, you'll know that it ran right past sections of the wall. So the wall wasn't just about keeping enemies out. It was also about flexing, about saying, "Look at us. We're the Han dynasty. We've got walls, we've got silk, and we're not afraid to use either." But again, effectiveness was questionable. Nomads were still a problem, smugglers still smuggled, and wall maintenance? Yeah, let's just say the budget wasn't always there. A giant wall is great until it starts crumbling and no one wants to fix it. Fast forward a few centuries and the cycle continues. Dynasties rise, dynasties fall, and each one leaves its fingerprints on the wall. Some rebuilt sections, some expanded, others completely ignored it. It was like inheriting a very large, very expensive house that you didn't really want, but couldn't exactly sell either. And this, I think, is what makes the Great Wall so fascinating. It's not a monument built in one heroic effort. It's a patchwork of political anxiety, dynasty after dynasty trying to one-up each other. But the dynasty that really put the great in Great Wall, that would be the Ming. By the 14th century, China had suffered through the Mongol invasions. And let's be honest, after Genghis Khan's descendants stormed through your countryside, you're gonna be a little paranoid. So when the Ming emperors came to power, they doubled down on the wall idea. Only this time, they weren't messing around with dirt. Oh no, they used stone and bricks. Finally, some architectural dignity. And this is the wall most tourists recognize today. Those dramatic stone ramparts snaking over the mountains, that's Ming handiwork. The Ming also added proper watchtowers, signal beacons, and garrisons. It became less of a wall and more of an entire defensive system. At its peak, it was manned by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Because what's the point of building a massive wall if you don't also turn it into the world's least fun dormitory? Still, here's the cosmic joke. Even the Ming Wall didn't completely keep out invaders. In the 17th century, the Manchu forces just walked through when a Ming general opened the gates for them. Yes, after centuries of backbreaking labor, the downfall of the Ming wasn't a breach in the wall, but simple treachery. All that stone, all those bricks, and one guy with bad loyalty issues undid the whole thing. History, ladies and gentlemen. But before we drift further into the dynastic merry-go-round, let's pause and take in the irony. The Great Wall, this enormous symbol of strength and endurance, wasn't really that effective militarily. But as a psychological weapon, as a symbol of empire and persistence, oh, it nailed that part. It impressed subjects, it intimidated enemies, and today, it keeps the tourism industry thriving. So maybe it worked after all. All right, that feels like a nice little starting lap around the early days of the wall. In the next stretch, we'll wander deeper into the dynasties, the everyday life of soldiers stationed on the wall, and the weird myths that cling to those stones like ivy. Because trust me, there are plenty of them. But let's stay slow, smooth, unhurried, because if the wall teaches us anything, it's that history doesn't always move quickly. Sometimes it just drags itself over mountains, brick by brick, dynasty by dynasty. All right, so we've watched the Ming dynasty pour their paranoia into stone. We've seen the Manchu walk through the gates anyway. And after that, well, the wall just sort of sat there. Because once the Qing dynasty took over in the 17th century, they weren't really interested in the whole wall business. Why would they be? The Manchu were the horsemen from the steppe. They didn't need to wall themselves off from themselves. So the wall stopped being a military project, and instead it became what all giant abandoned structures eventually become: a ruin. For a couple hundred years, nobody really cared about the Great Wall. It was too big to demolish, too broken to fix, and too inconvenient to live in. Farmers stripped stones for their houses. Villagers grazed goats on it. Some sections crumbled into the earth like abandoned sandcastles. If you lived near the wall in the 18th or 19th century, it wasn't a wonder of the world. It was just there. A very large, very lumpy reminder that empires come and go. Then the 20th century happened, and suddenly the wall had a new job: propaganda. See, after centuries of being ignored, the wall got rediscovered by modern nation builders. Early 1900s China was a mess. Foreign invasions, warlords, revolutions, civil wars, you name it. And in the middle of all that chaos, the wall started to look like a convenient symbol, a way to say, hey, we may be fractured now, but remember, we built this. In the 1930s, during the Japanese invasion of China, the wall even saw action again. Not much, but enough to make the newspapers. Chinese troops fought a few skirmishes along the wall near Beijing. Imagine trying to use a 400-year-old ruin as a trench. It wasn't practical, but it was symbolic. And in times of war, symbols matter. Then came Mao Zedong. Now, Mao had complicated feelings about history. On the one hand, he liked to break with the past. On the other, he really liked using history as a backdrop for speeches. And so the Great Wall became a communist metaphor. Mao himself famously wrote a poem in 1935 while on the Long March. The key line, "He who has never been to the Great Wall is not a true man," which sounds kind of macho for a poem, but hey, it stuck. From then on, visiting the wall wasn't just tourism, it was patriotism. School trips, party officials, foreign dignitaries, everyone had to walk at least one stretch, take a photo, and prove they were true. And tourism, oh boy. By the late 20th century, the wall had become China's greatest marketing asset. Forget the terracotta warriors, forget the Forbidden City, the wall was the headline act. Sections near Beijing, like Badaling, were rebuilt and paved over. Busloads of tourists climbed up in sneakers and baseball caps, snapping photos on disposable cameras. Guides pointed at the stones and said, "Look, thousands of years old." Meanwhile, the more remote sections just kept quietly crumbling in the mountains. So really, the wall became two things at once. On one side, a glossy tour group in matching hats, trudging up Badaling with bottled water and selfie sticks. On the other, a shepherd somewhere in the Inner Mongolia, leaning against a half-buried wall fragment while his goats nibble weeds. Both are the wall, both are true, and both show how history can mean totally different things depending on who's looking at it. Now, there's a persistent myth we should gently clear up here. You've probably heard someone say, the Great Wall is the only man-made structure visible from space, which sounds very cool, except no, it isn't. Astronauts have confirmed it's actually really hard to see with the naked eye. It's too narrow and it blends in with the landscape. You're more likely to spot highways or airports. So the wall's reputation as the ultimate astronaut selfie backdrop is, unfortunately, exaggerated. But hey, let's not ruin the bedtime fantasy. It's still very long, just not that visible. Hey guys, welcome back. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's take a very slow walk through one of history's longest building projects. And yes, I mean long, because tonight we're talking about the Great Wall of China. Now, the thing about the Great Wall is that it's one of those monuments everyone knows about, but very few people actually understand. It's like the Mona Lisa of architecture. Everyone's seen it on a postcard, but no one has actually thought about the fact that it took centuries of bad leadership decisions, questionable military strategy, and quite a lot of forced labor to make it happen. So let's just float back a couple thousand years and settle in. Don't worry, this won't be one of those action-packed history documentaries with pounding drums and swooping camera shots. Nope, we're just here to take the scenic route across stones, dirt, and dynasties. Because if there's anything the wall represents, it's stubbornness stretched out over 13,000 miles. So, where do we even start? Technically, the Great Wall isn't even one wall. It's more like a bad group project where every dynasty added their own little section, didn't match the design, and then left the mess for the next guy to deal with. Some walls were made of tamped earth, some were made of stone, some collapsed within a decade. Others are still standing centuries later. In short, it was less a single continuous barrier and more like a weird family quilt sewn together by people who hated each other. But of course, the Chinese emperors loved a good PR spin, so they called it Wanli Chongcheng, the Long Wall of 10,000 Li. That's about 5,500 miles, though if you're being picky, some estimates stretch it to 13,000. Basically, if you walked it, you'd need very good shoes and possibly a therapist afterward. Now, the first emperor to really get this whole let's build a massive wall idea rolling was Qin Shi Huang. And if you know anything about Qin Shi Huang, you'll know he was basically the overachiever nobody liked. This is the guy who unified China, burned books, buried scholars alive, and thought drinking mercury was a solid long-term health choice. So yes, of course he was also the first to say, hey, let's link all these random little border walls into one giant mega wall. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler, everything. Because while Qin Shi Huang had the vision, he also had a workforce made up of peasants, convicts, and soldiers who probably would have preferred to do literally anything else. The working conditions? Brutal. The pay? Essentially non-existent. And the food? Let's just say a lot of those workers didn't exactly make it back home. Legend even says their bodies were buried inside the wall itself, which isn't technically true, but it's the kind of morbid bedtime story that's stuck around anyway. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the Qin dynasty, China already had smaller defensive walls. We're talking as far back as the 7th century BCE, when the various warring kingdoms decided they really didn't like each other, or the nomadic tribes lurking just beyond their borders. So each little kingdom built its own sad attempt at a wall. Imagine a bunch of neighbors building fences out of whatever junk they had lying around. Some used packed dirt, some used wood, and most of them crumbled faster than you can say, cheap construction. When Qin Shi Huang took over in 221 BCE, he basically looked at all these patchy walls and said, yeah, let's make this my legacy. Forget the fact that nobody actually asked for a wall. Forget that nomadic horsemen could just ride around it anyway. The important thing was to make a statement, and Qin loved statements. This is the same man who built the Terracotta Army, after all. He wasn't exactly a minimalist. Of course, the building process was less about architectural genius and more about throwing bodies at a problem until it sort of worked. The workers would ram layer after layer of earth into wooden frames until they had a giant dirt pancake masquerading as a wall. And when I say ram, I mean literally stomping and pounding the soil into submission with wooden tools. Very high-tech stuff. Now, dirt walls might sound flimsy, but surprisingly, some of those tamped earth sections are still standing today, which says less about their quality and more about how much people in the 21st century don't really mess with old dirt. But still, it's impressive. The funny thing is, for all the effort, Qin Shi Huang's wall didn't actually do its job. You see, nomadic groups like the Xiongnu weren't exactly dumb. They didn't walk up to the wall, see the dirt, and go, "Oh no, impenetrable barrier." No, they just found gaps, bribed guards, or, wait for it, went around. Revolutionary tactics, I know. So, while the wall looked intimidating on a map, in practice, it was about as effective as putting a "do not enter" sign on your diary. People just ignored it. After Qin's dynasty collapsed, because apparently ruling with paranoia and mercury poisoning isn't sustainable, the next big player was the Han dynasty. And here's where things got more interesting. The Han were like, okay, Qin had the right idea, but let's not just make a wall. Let's also build fortresses, watchtowers, and garrisons along it. Essentially, they tried to turn the wall into a military highway. And to be fair, it worked. Sort of. The Han dynasty's wall-building efforts stretched thousands of miles. Soldiers stationed there could light signal fires to warn about invasions. Imagine the world's oldest version of a group chat. Only instead of LOL and emojis, you got a column of smoke saying, "Nomads incoming, please advise." Now, the Han also used the wall to protect the Silk Road, because by this time, trade with Central Asia was becoming a very big deal. And if you've ever seen a map of the Silk Road, you'll know that it ran right past sections of the wall. So the wall wasn't just about keeping enemies out. It was also about flexing, about saying, look at us, we're the Han dynasty, we've got walls, we've got silk, and we're not afraid to use either. But again, effectiveness was questionable. Nomads were still a problem, smugglers still smuggled, and wall maintenance? Yeah, let's just say the budget wasn't always there. A giant wall is great until it starts crumbling and no one wants to fix it. Fast forward a few centuries and the cycle continues. Dynasties rise, dynasties fall, and each one leaves its fingerprints on the wall. Some rebuilt sections, some expanded, others completely ignored it. It was like inheriting a very large, very expensive house that you didn't really want, but couldn't exactly sell either. And this, I think, is what makes the Great Wall so fascinating. It's not a monument built in one heroic effort. It's a patchwork of political anxiety, dynasty after dynasty trying to one-up each other. But the dynasty that really put the great in Great Wall, that would be the Ming. By the 14th century, China had suffered through the Mongol invasions. And let's be honest, after Genghis Khan's descendants stormed through your countryside, you're gonna be a little paranoid. So when the Ming emperors came to power, they doubled down on the wall idea. Only this time, they weren't messing around with dirt. Oh no, they used stone and bricks. Finally, some architectural dignity. And this is the wall most tourists recognize today. Those dramatic stone ramparts snaking over the mountains, that's Ming handiwork. The Ming also added proper watchtowers, signal beacons, and garrisons. It became less of a wall and more of an entire defensive system. At its peak, it was manned by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Because what's the point of building a massive wall if you don't also turn it into the world's least fun dormitory? Still, here's the cosmic joke. Even the Ming Wall didn't completely keep out invaders. In the 17th century, the Manchu forces just walked through when a Ming general opened the gates for them. Yes, after centuries of back-breaking labor, the downfall of the Ming wasn't a breach in the wall, but simple treachery. All that stone, all those bricks, and one guy with bad loyalty issues undid the whole thing. History, ladies and gentlemen. But before we drift further into the dynastic merry-go-round, let's pause and take in the irony. The Great Wall, this enormous symbol of strength and endurance, wasn't really that effective militarily. But as a psychological weapon, as a symbol of empire and persistence, oh, it nailed that part. It impressed subjects, it intimidated enemies, and today, it keeps the tourism industry thriving. So maybe it worked after all. All right, that feels like a nice little starting lap around the early days of the wall. In the next stretch, we'll wander deeper into the dynasties, the everyday life of soldiers stationed on the wall, and the weird myths that cling to those stones like ivy, because trust me, there are plenty of them. But let's stay slow, smooth, unhurried, because if the wall teaches us anything, it's that history doesn't always move quickly. Sometimes it just drags itself over mountains, brick by brick, dynasty by dynasty. So, let's keep walking. We've seen emperors throwing walls at their problems. We've seen peasants ramming dirt into wooden frames like human jackhammers. But what about the people who actually had to live on the wall? Because yes, contrary to the tourist's fantasy of majestic stone walkway with sweeping views, the Great Wall was basically a long, cold, uncomfortable workplace. Imagine being stationed on top of a mountain in northern China, surrounded by howling winds, with nothing but bricks, rice porridge, and the occasional signal fire to break the monotony. That was daily life for the soldiers of the wall. Now, the Ming Dynasty took wall duty very seriously. They manned it with an estimated 300,000 soldiers at its peak, which sounds impressive until you realize those soldiers were basically stuck in what amounted to medieval cubicles with worse insulation. Picture this: small watchtowers perched every few hundred meters. Inside, a couple of soldiers huddled together, trying to stay warm while keeping an eye out for nomads. The towers weren't exactly cozy Airbnbs either. Most were made of bare stone, with maybe a straw mat or two. If you were lucky, there'd be a little stove. If you weren't, well, you learned to appreciate numb fingers. Food? Ah, yes, the highlight of every soldier's day. Rice, millet, maybe a vegetable or two if supplies made it through. Meat was rare. Alcohol? Technically banned, but let's be honest. Soldiers are soldiers. You don't guard 13,000 miles of stones sober. Somewhere in there, a bottle or two always found its way up the wall. And the boredom. My God, the boredom. If you think scrolling TikTok for hours is mind-numbing, imagine standing on a wall and staring into empty plains for months on end. The occasional bandit raid might spice things up, but most of the time it was just cold wind, cold stone, and waiting. Lots of waiting. Soldiers passed the time by gambling, chatting, or carving little graffiti into the stones. Some even smuggled in women, which the Ming authorities were not thrilled about. But hey, humans are humans, even when they're supposed to be guarding the empire. The wall wasn't just about soldiers, though. Around major fortresses, entire communities developed. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and families of the soldiers clustered nearby. These weren't glamorous towns, more like survival outposts. Mud huts, market stalls, maybe a noodle shop if you were lucky. Life revolved around keeping the wall manned and supplied. And speaking of supply, let's appreciate for a second how insanely difficult it was to keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers fed and clothed in the middle of nowhere. Grain caravans had to travel across mountains. Horses had to be fed hay that didn't really grow naturally in the desert. Boots wore out constantly. It was like running the world's most inconvenient Costco. Now, let's float back to the Ming emperors themselves, because they weren't exactly normal either. Take the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming Dynasty. He was born a poor peasant, rose to power through rebellion, and then basically turned into the most paranoid dad imaginable. He had dozens of kids, hundreds of concubines, and trust issues bigger than the wall itself. Hongwu loved punishments. Torture, executions, purges, you name it. He once had 30,000 people executed because he thought there was a conspiracy against him. And yes, 30,000 is not a typo. This is the guy setting the tone for the dynasty that would pour millions of man-hours into rebuilding the wall. Safe to say, when your founding emperor is that paranoid, your dynasty is going to be big on defensive architecture. Then we get emperors like Yangla. Now, Yangla was ambitious. He moved the capital to Beijing, built the Forbidden City, and sponsored Zheng He's voyages across the Indian Ocean. He also pushed hard on the whole "let's make the wall fancy" project. His generals extended it, reinforced it, and turned it into a proper stone bulwark. But again, the wall wasn't just about defense. It was about optics. It was about saying, we're the Ming, we're organized, we've got bricks, manpower, and a very deep sense of insecurity about nomads. Speaking of nomads, the Ming obsession with the wall was basically a centuries-long "please go away" letter to the Mongols. After the Yuan dynasty, aka the Mongol dynasty, collapsed, the Ming were determined never to let horsemen from the steppe rule China again. The wall was their psychological therapy, a 13,000-mile coping mechanism. And it sort of worked. The Mongols didn't vanish, but they were pushed back. Of course, trade and bribery still happened across the frontier, because you can't really wall off human greed. But the Ming at least felt safer, knowing they had stone between themselves and the north. One little ironic detail. For all the soldiers on the wall, a lot of them weren't exactly, well, good soldiers. Many were poorly trained. Many were farmers handed spears and told, "Congratulations, you're in the army now." Pay was often late, supplies got lost, corruption was rampant. So, while the Ming Wall looks intimidating today, the reality was more like, sure, we've got towers and soldiers, but the soldiers are napping and the tower roof leaks. And this brings us to the great cosmic joke again. The Ming spent centuries reinforcing the wall. They poured stone into mountains, stationed armies, and bragged about their defenses. And yet, when the Manchu came knocking in the 1600s, it wasn't siege warfare that brought the dynasty down. It was betrayal. One general, Wu Songhui, decided he'd rather open the gates and side with the invaders than fight them. And just like that, the wall's grand purpose evaporated. All those stones, all those soldiers, undone by one man's bad day. But here's the thing. Even though the wall failed spectacularly at its original purpose, it still succeeded in ways the Ming never expected. It became a symbol. It became legend. And it became, well, kind of an accidental metaphor for how human stubbornness outlives practicality. Because really, what is the Great Wall if not a giant, centuries-long group project in futility? And yet, here we are. Thousands of tourists walking it every day, photographers calling it one of the wonders of the world, and you, lying in bed right now, listening to me drone on about soldiers eating cold millet on a mountain 500 years ago. So, let's float a little deeper into the myths, because where there's a wall that big, there are bound to be legends. One of the most famous is the tale of Meng Jiangnu. She was a woman whose husband was sent off to build the wall, and, like many workers, died during the construction. When she found out, she went to the wall and cried so hard that a section of it collapsed, revealing his bones. Is it true? Of course not. But it's a powerful story. It turns the wall from stone and mortar into something human, something emotional, a reminder that behind every brick was a pair of hands. Behind every tower was a life. And in that sense, the legend of Meng Jiangnu is just as important as the history. Because walls aren't really about bricks. They're about people. And the Great Wall, for all its size, is really just a monument to human suffering and human stubbornness. Let's slow down here. We've crossed Qin and Han. We've trudged through Ming paranoia. We've peeked into towers full of shivering soldiers. And we've shed a quiet tear from Ming Jiangnu. In the next part, we'll drift into the modern era. How the wall transformed from a half-forgotten ruin into a national symbol, a tourist trap, and a marketing slogan. Spoiler, it has a lot to do with 20th century politics and people rediscovering how good stone walls look on postcards. But for now, just let the image settle in. A soldier on the wall, wind in his face, rice porridge in his bowl, watching an empty horizon, waiting for an enemy who might never come.
So let's take a slow step sideways. Because while China was busy stretching 13,000 miles of wall across mountains, other cultures were also stacking stones, each convinced they were solving some existential crisis. Spoiler, they weren't. But the effort makes for very soothing bedtime stories. Let's start with Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Built by the Romans in the 2nd century CE, it was named after Emperor Hadrian, the guy who decided the Roman Empire had grown big enough, thank you very much, and maybe it was time to draw a line in the sand, or more accurately, in the damp hills of northern England. The walls stretched about 73 miles coast to coast, which sounds tiny compared to China's mega project, but remember, this was Britain, a small island where everyone argued about sheep and weather. To the Romans, it was a serious line of defense. To modernize, it's more like a very ambitious hiking trail. Daily life there wasn't glamorous either. Roman soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall spent their days patrolling, repairing stones, and trying not to freeze in the perpetual drizzle. Some came from warmer parts of the empire, Spain, Syria, North Africa. Imagine being shipped from sunny Iberia to a soggy hill in Newcastle. Talk about a downgrade. And, much like in China, the wall didn't exactly stop enemies. The local tribes, the Picts and others, could sneak around, bribe guards, or just wait until the soldiers were too busy complaining about the rain. But again, symbolism mattered more than strategy. Hadrian's Wall was Rome saying, "This is our limit. Beyond this point, barbarians, don't ask." Then there's the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. Now these were actually good walls. Built in the 5th century by Emperor Theodosius II, they were a triple-layered system with towers, moats, and all the medieval trimmings. For 1,000 years, they protected Constantinople from sieges that would have crushed any lesser city. Imagine layer upon layer of stone rising along the Bosphorus, shining in the sun, while invaders camped outside and realized, oh, right, that's not going to be easy. And it wasn't. From Huns to Arabs to Crusaders, most attackers broke themselves against those walls. Of course, nothing lasts forever. In 1453, the Ottomans rolled in with cannons the size of small houses and blew holes through centuries of masonry. Because yes, no matter how many bricks you stack, technology eventually laughs in your face. Walls weren't just about defense, though. Sometimes they were about vanity. Take the walls of Babylon, or as later writers described them, massive stone barriers that were apparently wide enough for chariots to ride on top. Did they really look like that? Historians argue, archaeologists shrug, but the idea of giant shining walls around one of the ancient world's greatest cities has stuck in our collective imagination. Then again, ancient Mesopotamian kings had a habit of exaggerating their achievements. So if they claimed the walls were unbreachable, chances are they weren't. But they did look good in inscriptions, and that's what mattered. Even medieval Europe got in on the action. City walls sprouted everywhere, from Carcassonne in France to Avila in Spain. Tall towers, crenellations, moats, they made towns look like fortresses, even if most were just protecting farmers' markets and the occasional chicken thief. And again, the psychology mattered more than the military value. Walking through a big stone gate made people feel safe, even if, historically, most sieges ended with gates burning, walls crumbling, and residents realizing that maybe stone wasn't enough after all. So what do we notice here? Whether it's the Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall, or the fortifications of Constantinople, walls are less about keeping enemies out and more about making rulers feel better about themselves. A wall says, "I did something. Look, it's huge." Even if it doesn't actually work, it's proof of effort, and rulers, whether Roman, Chinese, or Byzantine, loved to show they were doing something big. And here's where the irony comes in. Because walls often become monuments long after their practical use disappears. The Great Wall is now a tourist trail. Hadrian's Wall is a hiking path with sheep. The Theodosian walls are photo backdrops in Istanbul. Nobody remembers the day-to-day failures, they just remember the stones. And, in a weird way, that's comforting, because it means human stubbornness, even when useless, has a way of leaving beauty behind. Now, let's circle back to the people who actually lived with these walls, because if there's a common thread across all of them, it's that the soldiers, guards, and townsfolk weren't exactly thrilled. Roman soldiers at Hadrian's Wall carved graffiti into the stones. Some scratched rude jokes, others left prayers, basically the world's first bathroom stall doodles. Soldiers in Constantinople wrote petitions begging for back pay, even while manning the most famous walls in the world. And in China, work laborers sang sad work songs about being far from home, ramming dirt in silence while thinking of their families. So the reality of great walls wasn't greatness, it was boredom, bad food, and blisters, which honestly is very human. Let's drift a little slower here. Picture it, a Roman soldier in Britain, staring out over damp hills, muttering about the cold, a Byzantine guard in Constantinople, leaning on his spear, staring at the sea, a Chinese soldier on the Great Wall, eating rice porridge while the wind cuts through his cloak. 3 different walls, 3 different empires, and yet, all the same silence, all the same waiting. That's the strange magic of walls. They're built for action, for war, for grand defense. But most of the time they just sit there, hosting very ordinary lives. A wall is less about epic battles and more about endless, uneventful days stacked on top of each other. And maybe that's why they endure in memory, because they weren't just monuments of stone, they were monuments of time. Okay, let's let that thought settle. In the next part, we'll wander back to China one more time and look at how the wall fits into the bigger picture of Chinese history, not as a military structure, but as an idea, a story of unity, anxiety, and endurance that shaped how China saw itself. But for now, let's just let the walls, Roman, Byzantine, and Chinese, melt back into the landscape where they've always belonged.
So let's take a slow step sideways. Because while China was busy stretching 13,000 miles of wall across mountains, other cultures were also stacking stones, each convinced they were solving some existential crisis. Spoiler, they weren't. But the effort makes for very soothing bedtime stories. Let's start with Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Built by the Romans in the 2nd century CE, it was named after Emperor Hadrian, the guy who decided the Roman Empire had grown big enough, thank you very much, and maybe it was time to draw a line in the sand, or more accurately, in the damp hills of northern England. The walls stretched about 73 miles coast to coast, which sounds tiny compared to China's mega project,
But remember, this was Britain, a small island where everyone argued about sheep and weather. To the Romans, it was a serious line of defense. To modernize, it's more like a very ambitious hiking trail. Daily life there wasn't glamorous either. Roman soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall spent their days patrolling, repairing stones, and trying not to freeze in the perpetual drizzle. Some came from warmer parts of the empire, Spain, Syria, North Africa. Imagine being shipped from sunny Iberia to a soggy hill in Newcastle. Talk about a downgrade. And, much like in China, the wall didn't exactly stop enemies. The local tribes, the Picts and others, could sneak around, bribe guards, or just wait until the soldiers were too busy complaining about the rain. But again, symbolism mattered more than strategy. Hadrian's Wall was Rome saying, "This is our limit. Beyond this point, barbarians, don't ask." Then there's the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. Now these were actually good walls. Built in the 5th century by Emperor Theodosius II, they were a triple-layered system with towers, moats, and all the medieval trimmings. For 1,000 years, they protected Constantinople from sieges that would have crushed any lesser city. Imagine layer upon layer of stone rising along the Bosphorus, shining in the sun, while invaders camped outside and realized, oh, right, that's not going to be easy. And it wasn't. From Huns to Arabs to Crusaders, most attackers broke themselves against those walls. Of course, nothing lasts forever. In 1453, the Ottomans rolled in with cannons the size of small houses and blew holes through centuries of masonry. Because yes, no matter how many bricks you stack, technology eventually laughs in your face. Walls weren't just about defense, though. Sometimes they were about vanity. Take the walls of Babylon, or as later writers described them, massive stone barriers that were apparently wide enough for chariots to ride on top. Did they really look like that? Historians argue, archaeologists shrug, but the idea of giant shining walls around one of the ancient world's greatest cities has stuck in our collective imagination. Then again, ancient Mesopotamian kings had a habit of exaggerating their achievements, so if they claimed the walls were unbreachable, chances are they weren't. But they did look good in inscriptions, and that's what mattered. Even medieval Europe got in on the action. City walls sprouted everywhere, from Carcassonne in France to Avila in Spain. Tall towers, crenellations, moats, they made towns look like fortresses, even if most were just protecting farmers' markets and the occasional chicken thief. And again, the psychology mattered more than the military value. Walking through a big stone gate made people feel safe, even if, historically, most sieges ended with gates burning, walls crumbling, and residents realizing that maybe stone wasn't enough after all. So what do we notice here? Whether it's the Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall, or the fortifications of Constantinople, walls are less about keeping enemies out and more about making rulers feel better about themselves. A wall says, "I did something. Look, it's huge." Even if it doesn't actually work, it's proof of effort, and rulers, whether Roman, Chinese, or Byzantine, loved to show they were doing something big. And here's where the irony comes in. Because walls often become monuments long after their practical use disappears. The Great Wall is now a tourist trail. Hadrian's Wall is a hiking path with sheep. The Theodosian walls are photo backdrops in Istanbul. Nobody remembers the day-to-day failures, they just remember the stones. And, in a weird way, that's comforting, because it means human stubbornness, even when useless, has a way of leaving beauty behind. Now, let's circle back to the people who actually lived with these walls, because if there's a common thread across all of them, it's that the soldiers, guards, and townsfolk weren't exactly thrilled. Roman soldiers at Hadrian's Wall carved graffiti into the stones. Some scratched rude jokes, others left prayers, basically the world's first bathroom stall doodles. Soldiers in Constantinople wrote petitions begging for back pay, even while manning the most famous walls in the world. And in China, work laborers sang sad work songs about being far from home, ramming dirt in silence while thinking of their families. So the reality of Great Walls wasn't greatness, it was boredom, bad food, and blisters, which honestly is very human. Let's drift a little slower here. Picture it, a Roman soldier in Britain, staring out over damp hills, muttering about the cold, a Byzantine guard in Constantinople, leaning on his spear, staring at the sea, a Chinese soldier on the Great Wall, eating rice porridge while the wind cuts through his cloak. 3 different walls, 3 different empires, and yet, all the same silence, all the same waiting. That's the strange magic of walls. They're built for action, for war, for grand defense. But most of the time they just sit there, hosting very ordinary lives. A wall is less about epic battles and more about endless, uneventful days stacked on top of each other. And maybe that's why they endure in memory, because they weren't just monuments of stone, they were monuments of time. Okay, let's let that thought settle. In the next part, we'll wander back to China one more time and look at how the wall fits into the bigger picture of Chinese history, not as a military structure, but as an idea, a story of unity, anxiety, and endurance that shaped how China saw itself. But for now, let's just let the walls, Roman, Byzantine, and Chinese, melt back into the landscape where they've always belonged.
So, let's settle into the softer side of things. We've covered construction, politics, symbolism. Now we'll linger on what I like to call the leftovers. The little details that don't fit neatly into big historical arcs, but make the wall feel alive. First up, the legends. Because no matter how solid the stone, people always wrapped it in stories. The most famous is Ming Zhang-nu, the devoted wife who trekked to the wall to bring her husband winter clothes, only to discover he had died as a conscript laborer. She wept so hard, her tears brought a section of the wall tumbling down, revealing his bones beneath. It's tragic, of course, but also symbolic. The wall isn't just about emperors and soldiers. It's about countless lives lost in the shadows, remembered only through a folktale where grief is literally stronger than stone. Another story drifts out of the Ming Dynasty. Supposedly, there was a general who dreamed that the wall was a dragon coiling across the land, which, to be fair, is exactly what it looks like on a map. Dragons, in Chinese thought, were symbols of power, authority, and cosmic energy. So seeing the wall as a dragon wasn't just poetic, it was a way of making the empire's boundary feel divine. Because why settle for boring pile of rocks when you can say, giant celestial reptile protecting civilization? Then there's the day-to-day reality. What was life like for the people stuck on the wall? Spoiler, monotonous. Soldiers stationed at watchtowers had long stretches of nothing. Standing guard, cooking millet porridge, patching clothes, the occasional wolf howl. And sometimes, the occasional Mongol raid. But most of the time, it was boredom. The kind of boredom that makes you carve your name into bricks, doodle on wooden slips, or invent elaborate drinking games with your fellow sentries. We even have archaeological finds, dice, gaming pieces, bits of poetry scratched into walls, proof that humans, no matter where they are, even on a lonely, wind-blasted tower, will always find ways to kill time. Food was another constant theme. Soldiers ate millet, beans, a little meat if they were lucky, dried vegetables, and yes, alcohol. Because apparently, no empire has ever thought it wise to arm tired men with spears and rice wine, but they did it anyway. There are even accounts of rations being so bad that soldiers foraged for roots and wild plants,
which means the great defenders of the empire sometimes looked less like mighty warriors and more like part-time gardeners. Now, modern times haven't been much kinder to the wall either. For centuries, locals treated it like a free Home Depot. Need bricks? Pull them from the wall. Need stones for your pig pen? The wall's got you. Some sections vanished into entire villages, repurposed one wheelbarrow at a time. And honestly, you can't blame them. If you're a farmer in the 1800s and there's a giant pile of cut stone just sitting there, are you really going to chisel new blocks out of a quarry? No. You're taking the wall. Tourism brought its own oddities. There are stories of visitors carving their names, couples leaving locks, and even people attempting to barbecue on the wall. One infamous incident in the early 2000s involved someone driving a car onto it, just because, well, they could. There's even been an ultra marathon along the wall, which sounds heroic until you realize it involves running up and down thousands of stone steps in blazing sun while tourists in flip-flops stare at you like you've lost your mind. And yet, despite all this indignity, the wall survives. It crumbles, yes. It fades, yes. But it's still here. The strangest twist is how it's become a global cliché. Movies film epic battles on it. Advertisers use it to sell cars. At one point, there was even a rumor that you could see it from space with the naked eye. Spoiler, you can't. Astronauts confirmed it's basically invisible from orbit, blending into the mountains like any other ridge. But the fact that people want it to be visible from space says more than the fact itself. It shows how the wall has ballooned into a symbol of human persistence, regardless of whether it's actually visible or practical. And then there's the small, quiet reality. The wall isn't just the postcard stretch near Beijing. It's thousands of miles of broken earthworks, low ridges, buried foundations. In some places, it's barely higher than a curb. In others, it's melted into the soil so much that only archaeologists with fancy equipment know it's there. The wall is less a single thing than a memory scattered across landscapes. Part fortress, part ruin, part myth. So let's linger there for a moment. Picture a lonely shepherd in Inner Mongolia, leaning on his staff, his sheep grazing among broken wall stones. He doesn't think of it as the Great Wall. To him, it's just the old ridge where his flock wanders. Picture a farmer in the 1800s prying out a brick to build a pig pen. No grand meaning, just practicality. And then picture a tourist today, sweating on the steps, snapping selfies with a plastic bottle of Coke in hand. 3 lives, 3 centuries, 1 wall. All seeing it differently. That's what makes it great. Not just the emperors and the myths, but the fact that across time, people keep interacting with it in small, ordinary, stubbornly human ways. So, to wrap this wandering meditation, the Great Wall isn't really about war or defense or even unity. It's about endurance in all its forms. Endurance of stone, endurance of stories, endurance of memory. It's not perfect, it's not eternal, it's not visible from space. But it lingers, quietly across mountains and minds alike. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.
So, here we are again, back in China. We've traced the wall from dirt mounds in the Qin dynasty to Ming stone fortresses to crumbling ruins and glossy tourist brochures. But the truth is, the Great Wall isn't just physical, it's mental, it's cultural, it's the story China tells itself. Think about it. The wall was never truly effective. Nomads went around, generals betrayed it, stones crumbled, and yet, for over 2,000 years, people kept coming back to the idea of it. They rebuilt it, reimagined it, retold its purpose. Because the wall wasn't really about enemies outside. It was about anxieties inside, the fear of chaos, the fear of losing control, the fear of being swallowed by the endless steppe. And so stone by stone, dynasty by dynasty, China built its fears into the mountains. Now,
Chinese culture has always been big on metaphors, and the wall became the biggest metaphor of all. It symbolized strength, permanence, unity. You could stand on it, look at the horizon, and feel like the empire stretched as far as your eyes could see. Even when emperors were corrupt, soldiers unpaid, and peasants starving, the wall was still there, silent, solid, pretending everything was under control. And that's why, in the 20th century, the wall made such a convenient national symbol. Leaders didn't pick it because of its military history, they picked it because it was easy to say, "We are like the wall. We endure." When Mao said, "He who has never been to the Great Wall is not a true man," he wasn't talking about bricks. He was talking about willpower, about toughness, about the myth that China survives anything, just as the wall survives anything. Never mind the parts bulldozed by trucks. Never mind the sections melted back into the hills. The myth is what mattered. But here's the gentle irony. The wall, in its reality, is fragile. It erodes, it crumbles. It's vulnerable to weather, to time, to human neglect. Farmers dig out bricks, tourists carve names, sections collapse after heavy rains. And yet, in the imagination, it's indestructible, it's eternal. That gap between the fragile reality and the unbreakable idea is exactly what gives it power. This isn't unique to China, of course. Every culture builds myths around its monuments. Egyptians did it with the pyramids. The British do it with Stonehenge. Americans with the Statue of Liberty. But the wall is on a different scale because no other monument stretches for thousands of miles, carrying the weight of so many dynasties' hopes, fears, and egos. It's not just a wall, it's an archive, a very lumpy, very long archive of human stubbornness. Now, let's imagine for a moment what it felt like for someone in the Ming Dynasty standing on the wall at dawn, the horizon pink, the mountains fading into mist, behind you, the empire, ahead, the endless steppe. In that moment, the wall wasn't just stone, it was identity. It was the line between us and them, the line between order and chaos, the line between civilization and wilderness. Did it really make that line real? Not at all, but it felt real, and feelings in history matter as much as facts. There's also something deeply human about the way the wall keeps reappearing in Chinese art, poetry, and folklore. Painters brush it across scrolls, poets sigh about its endlessness, lovers whisper stories about tears bringing down sections of it. It doesn't matter if the wall itself is practical. What matters is that it inspires. And maybe that's why, unlike most abandoned fortifications, it never faded completely into obscurity. People needed it as an idea too much to let it vanish. Fast forward to today. For modern China, the wall is both heritage and branding. It's on posters, coins, and stamps. It's where Chinese school children are bussed for field trips. It's where politicians pose for photos with foreign leaders, smiling against the stone backdrop. And if you've ever watched a promotional video for the Beijing Olympics, you'll notice the wall always sneaks in somewhere. Because if you want to condense 5,000 years of messy history into a single image, nothing does it better than that line of stone crawling across the hills. It doesn't matter that most of the 13,000 miles are unphotogenic ruins. What matters is the postcard shot. But maybe that's fitting, because the Great Wall was always more story than stone, always more symbol than fortress, always more idea than defense. It was never just about keeping people out. It was about convincing people, inside and outside, that China was vast, united, and enduring. And in that sense, it worked perfectly. So when we call it great, we're not describing the engineering, we're describing the persistence of the idea. The Great Wall is great not because it kept enemies out. It didn't. It's great because it outlived the emperors who built it, the soldiers who guarded it, the dynasties who forgot it, and even the tourists who trample it today. It's still here, which means the idea is still here. Let's let that thought settle as the last image for tonight. The wall stretching across the mountains, a line between earth and sky. Fragile stone, eternal story. And you, closing your eyes, drifting away, carried not by battles or emperors, but by the quiet persistence of human hands stacking brick after brick, century after century. Because in the end, the truth about the Great Wall of China is simple. It wasn't built to keep people out. It was built so people would remember.
So here we are. We've wandered through dynasties, dragons, and sheep grazing on ruins, and yet the Great Wall still lingers in the mind, which makes sense, because walls are never just walls, they're always ideas too. And once you notice that, you start seeing walls everywhere. Take the Berlin Wall. Not exactly majestic, not exactly ancient, but one of the most famous walls of the modern age. Built in the 1960s, it wasn't about keeping invaders out, it was about keeping citizens in, which, if we're being honest, flips the whole wall logic on its head. The Berlin Wall didn't stretch for thousands of miles. It was ugly, covered in graffiti, barbed wire, checkpoints, and yet it too became a symbol, not of endurance, but of division. The Cold War condensed into concrete. And when it finally fell in 1989, people chipped away at it with hammers, carrying home fragments like souvenirs, which is funny if you think about it. A wall built to imprison ended up as paperweights on suburban coffee tables. Or think of the walls of Jericho, mentioned in the Bible, remembered mostly for tumbling down at the sound of trumpets, which is a nice story, but also shows another truth. Walls don't last forever. In myth or history, they always collapse eventually. And then there's the Hadrian's Wall hikers today, trudging along the soggy ridge with backpacks and granola bars, retracing a Roman emperor's nervous little boundary line. The wall becomes less about soldiers and more about weekend exercise. Even in language, we can't stop building walls. We talk about walls of silence, putting up walls between us, breaking down walls. We imagine them in relationships, in politics, in art, because the idea of dividing, of protecting, of separating is somehow stitched into our storytelling. Maybe that's the ultimate truth about walls. They're never just stone, they're a mirror. Whatever a society fears, it builds into its walls. Fear of outsiders, fear of chaos, fear of losing people, fear of losing control. Which brings us back, slowly, to the Great Wall of China, because it's more than the sum of its bricks. It's a record of 2,000 years of fear and pride, ambition and exhaustion, myth and memory. And here's the irony. The wall failed at its job over and over, but it succeeded in its story. It couldn't stop invaders, but it became unforgettable. It couldn't protect empires, but it outlived them. And in the end, which one really matters more? Let's slow down now. Picture the wall as it is today. Sections crumbling into the desert, sections gleaming near Beijing, rebuilt for tourists, and in between, endless miles of quiet ruin, hidden in valleys, swallowed by grass. Somewhere a shepherd still walks along it. Somewhere a student hikes up for the first time. Somewhere a historian mutters about its faults. And somewhere else a tired traveler sits on a stone, looks out at the horizon, and feels very small. And that's the real magic. The wall is great, not because of what it kept out, but because of what it lets in. A sense of scale, of time, of human stubbornness that stretches beyond any single lifetime. So as we drift to the end of this long, meandering story, here's the thought to carry with you. The Great Wall of China isn't just a monument, it's a reminder that we all build walls, in stone, in memory, in imagination. Some last, some fall, but all of them, in some way, tell us who we are and what we fear.
And maybe, if we're lucky, what we hope to endure. And with that, let the stones fade into the mountains, let the myths fade into silence, and let yourself drift, as countless centuries once did, staring at the horizon, waiting, listening, breathing with the wall. Good night.